This moment in Sudan's history requires utter clarity. It is crucial, I think, that we admit, particularly after this morning, that the existing strategy of the United States and the broader international community to end the genocide in Darfur and prevent all-out war in Sudan is failing. And it's time to alter our course of our policy in bold and specific ways in order to avert what could be the deadliest conflagration in Sudan's war-torn post-colonial history. As we all know, two of the principal pillars of the CPA are the elections and the referendum. But it's critical to note that the CPA also calls clearly for conditions that must exist for the holding of a credible election, including, as has been articulated this morning, a new security law to reduce the kind of harassment and intimidation of opposition, media access and freedom of assembly for opposition parties, and then, of course, unrestricted access for the international observation. Not one of these preconditions has been met to date. I think we have to stand up, and particularly this subcommittee has to stand up and say that the emperor is as naked as he ever was in the last 20 years of this ruling party, and blow the whistle now on this deadly charade. Why? Well, I think the risks of ignoring the prerequisites that are called for in the CPA for holding an election and the risks of holding a non-credible election are enormous. Why? Non-credible elections are going to do the following things. They're going to fuel violence and divisions throughout the country, but particularly in the South. And from my time living in southern Sudan in the 1990s and your frequent visits, as you well know, that was the deadliest time in Sudan's history because the ruling party in Khartoum was able to divide and destroy the South, was able to rip the South to pieces using these strategies of pulling opposition figures and arming them and having them attack and create intercommunal conflict. The second thing that non-credible elections will do is to undermine the fundamental aim of the CPA, which is a democratic transformation of the country. You don't start a process out of transforming the country with a non-free and a non-fair election. That sets the trend in the opposite direction. The third thing the non-credible election will do is to disenfranchise millions of Darfuris and fuel further violence there in Darfur as the contest erupts and the divisions that occur will be used by the National Congress Party and others who want to undermine stability and peace in Darfur to further instability. The fourth thing a non-credible election will do is to provide false legitimacy to an indicted war criminal and to the party that he represents. And that's the last thing we need to be doing, and that rolls right into the fifth thing, which is let's not waste tens of millions. I think the number is $96 million of U.S. taxpayers' money underwriting a non-credible election that's going to legitimize that war criminal. Until the parties, so what's the bottom line on this then? Until the parties agree to conditions that are in the CPA that will allow a credible election, I think the United States and the broader international community, but the United States has to lead it, we need to suspend all of our electoral assistance, the tens of millions of our taxpayers' dollars that are being spent on this thing. And the non-credible elections simply shouldn't be financed. We need to live by the principle. Non-credible elections shouldn't be financed by the United States taxpayers. And the parties, I think, we should encourage them to agree to delay these elections until the CPA mandated conditions for free and fair elections for democratic transformation exist, because we can't be party to recognizing the results of any election that doesn't meet basic standards. We've done it too many times around Africa, and this furthers problems and deepens problems rather than resolves them. However, we have to equally vigorously continue to press for those conditions for free and fair elections and press for the conditions, the necessary preconditions for holding the referendum on time. If we don't hold that referendum if the referendum is not held on time in January 2011, that's probably the most certain trigger for a return to full-scale national war. Now, to be clear, we're not demanding a postponement of the election per se, but what we're doing here, and there's a reason for it, is pushing for the conditions for a free and fair election as spelled out by the CPA. In other words, total adherence to the CPA, not selective adherence to the CPA. If the international community lets then the National Congress Party just gloss over the provisions that would create a fair election without any consequences, this will demonstrate, and this is the crucial point, this will demonstrate once again that we, the international community, lack the will to enforce the basic elements of the CPA. And what does that do? That signals to the CPA that it can wriggle out of further CPA requirements going down the road, which further imperils the fragile peace that exists today in the South. So that's why we're calling for the full implementation of the CPA. And we think rushing towards elections, which are 5 months away, without the proper conditions in place will end badly, particularly for the people of the South and the people of Darfur, and it will further embolden, this is the punchline, it will further embolden the National Congress Party to undermine the next major CPA process, which is the referendum. So we have to hold the line here. It's not a future benchmark we're looking at, it's a present one. But there's an even more important point from our perspective at the Enough Project. There is a reason Sudan is facing this 10 minutes till midnight make-or-break scenario that we're facing today. Until now, and this is, for me, the most important point the advocacy community can make, because there's been no cost for not implementation of key parts of the CPA, because there's been no cost for the commission of genocide, because there's been no cost for the commission of another genocide in the South, which wasn't called a genocide for 20 years, the parties, but particularly the National Congress Party, continue to trample on any agreement that is signed because there is no consequence for non-implementation. It's very obvious in basic human nature. So it's time, and this is why the Congress is so crucial, it's time for President Obama to decide to implement his own administration's benchmark-based policy. Because flouting the establishment of conditions for a credible election and the referendum, that should trigger immediate consequences now. The U.S. should work within the United Nations Security Council and outside of it, because a lot of things are simply not going to be able to move, as we all know, because of the membership there. And we should work to build that coalition of countries that are willing to introduce some of these consequences. Sometimes we'll have to go it alone, but let's at least do the diplomatic work to build the coalition to try to go multilaterally on some of these things and impose these consequences as soon as possible on the National Congress Party for its obstruction of basic conditions for peace. And the consequences, everyone always says, oh, we already tried pressure. This is what General Gration has said a number of times publicly. We've tried pressure, it doesn't work. We haven't. We haven't tried credible pressures, and we list a few here. And they're incredibly important, valuable points that Mr. Garish has raised in the panel of experts report about the effectiveness of sanctions when they're actually implemented, and the ineffective sanctions when you pass them but then you don't implement them and don't execute them. So first and foremost, we need to ratchet up and actually impose some of the targeted sanctions on the people listed in that confidential annex, and do it in a sequential way so people can see the tidal wave is coming at their head. So you can see you're working up through the chain of command on the basis of empirical evidence that these people are either obstructing implementation of agreements or actually responsible for grave human rights abuses. So we can do those multilateral sanctions, the travel bans and asset freezes. They're scarlet letters. They're political impacts for economic measures. Secondly, we can deny multilateral debt relief. The Sudanese government is on a mission right now. They want debt relief. They've got a serious economic problem. Even though they're making money hand over fist from the oil, they're going into private accounts. So publicly, the coffers are bare. They need multilateral debt relief. We need to be in every forum they're in asking for debt relief, saying, sorry, not today. Third, we can be pushing for enforcement of this arms embargo that has been talked about, and I'll just refer you back to the previous testimony. And then fourth, we can provide, as the United States, now that the conclusion of the process, the interagency process of examining what the Obama administration's policy should be towards the International Criminal Court is finished, we ought to be providing more robust support for the ICC investigations and indictments for ongoing atrocities. And all that word game, wordsmithing that was going on there about whether genocide is occurring or not in Darfur obscures the fact, just because 16 or 18 people, according to General Gration, died in Darfur, or whatever month he was referring to. Let's count the number, but we can't because we have no access. Let's count the number of women who have been raped. Let's count the number of children who are malnourished directly as a result of policies that are aimed at destroying in whole or in part a particular group of people. Call it genocide or don't call it genocide, it doesn't just mean gas chambers or village burning. Genocide has many different forms. Let's look at that. Now, these consequences in this confidential annex that General Gration says doesn't exist, which concerns me greatly, these are the instruments, if we are to believe Secretary Clinton and Ambassador Rice in their elaboration of this confidential annex, these are the consequences and the instruments that I think can help prevent an all-out war in Sudan. In conclusion, then, in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, you said you made a very important point about engagement. When we're talking about increasing consequences, we're not talking about cutting off negotiations, engagement. You have to engage to get your priorities advanced. But you use the consequences to back up and give leverage to the engagement. And we think, not to leave Darfur out of the equation here, we think it's time for a real diplomatic surge in Darfur. Let's not forget Darfur as we become obsessed with our efforts to try to prevent a return of the North-South war. And we think a surge, a diplomatic surge by the United States and its allies on Darfur should include the immediate drafting of a proposal, a peace proposal that addresses the root cause in Sudan, and put that draft down and start the debate and the dialogue between the Darfurians and amongst the broader Sudanese public about what the basic elements of a peace agreement will look like in Darfur. After 6 years of this nightmare for the people of Darfur, we have yet to have seen one document laid down by the United States and the broader international community that addresses the core issues that every Darfuri knows, lives, and breathes. It is a stunning failure of international diplomacy. There is nothing preventing us from going to Bachelet, the United Nations African Union representative, working with him to put the draft together. How many consultations more does one need to say these are the basic issues? Put those positions down and get people negotiating over an actual text. That'll move the ball forward. Thanks very much for having me, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Smith.